All right, let's get started. I am so excited to see so many people here. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. I want to just briefly do a really brief introduction because you're not here to listen to me. So this is part of our Rattlesnake stories that we do 4 sessions every winter, and then in the summer we go out, right? So this is the second of the one for this season. We have one in February with Jamie Jonkel, who's the bear management specialist for Missoula, who is a fascinating speaker, I will say. There's one in March about fire. People who are fire experts talking about the issue of fire in the rattlesnake, which seems really important right now. So that's what's coming up. I just want to tell you a little bit about Rattlesnake Creek Watershed Group, that we basically we work to, our mission, if you like, is to protect, preserve, restore as necessary the Rattlesnake Creek watershed, and also to bring in, to do events like this so that we are community events, education, science projects, lots of different projects to learn about the Rattlesnake Creek watershed. So that's kind of our mission. I'm going to introduce our speaker in a second. I'm curious to know how you heard about this event. How many of you learned about it through our newsletter? Okay, I like those hands. Okay. How about Facebook? All right, I run that, so I'm glad. I did notice there were a lot of likes and shares and things going on there. I guess the other 2 parts are we are listed in Missoula events today. Did anyone see that? Okay, it's worth doing. And we also put up posters, which I think nobody pays any attention to. But yes, all right, I love you. Thank you. I went all around town and around the hip strip saying we have this great event. And when I give it to people to put up, they say, oh, that sounds fascinating. I have to come. And then they don't come. So, but I actually enjoy going out and telling people who we are, the Rattlesnake Group. So, all right, let me jump to introducing our speaker. Mike Young, who actually is relatively new to Missoula, having moved here in 2019, which is when I moved here, and I still feel new, and then I keep running into people who's like, well, I've been here 25 years, and I still feel new, so anyway, Mike moved from Western Massachusetts, Westfield State College, did I get it right? Where he used to teach, where he taught geology and astronomy, and then retired to Missoula. And he was the president of the Shining Mountains. He just relinquished that. And we were curious as to who did you get to take your place? Okay, good. So, I'm just going to say that I met Mike because he led a group of us up the Upper Rattlesnake back in July and told us fascinating stories about remnants of buildings that were there. And I live in the Rattlesnake. I have hiked up there I don't know how many times, and I had never seen these things that he showed. So I got fascinated by it. And I want Mike to explain how he got fascinated by it and how he got into it. So, Mike, it's all yours. I don't know if you want to do that, right? See if your mic's working.
Okay.
Something's working.
Okay. Maybe now? Yeah. Ah, okay. Should I put the volume up a little bit, or? How's that? Okay. Well, thanks for asking me here today. I'm not nearly the expert that I'm hearing for the other talks, as this is something I've just gotten into in the last few months. And I suspect that I've made some mistakes and have just scratched the surface. So if you have some additional information, feel free to chime in. And I'd like to start out, as we do for our Wild Montana events, with an acknowledgement that we're on the traditional lands, the homelands of the Salish and Kalispel people, and to offer our respect for their history and culture, and for showing us the path to caring for these lands for generations to come. I don't have much to say about the indigenous history of the Upper Rattlesnake, although I suspect that there's some fascinating stories there too. But I have heard a couple of stories about how Rattlesnake Creek got its name that might or might not be right. Forrest Poe, who you'll hear more about in a little bit, has a story that's completely different than this. But I've heard that possibly the Salish name for the creek translates to rattlesnake, either because in the springtime when rocks are rolling down the creek bed, the noise sounds kind of like the rattle of a rattlesnake, or possibly because some of the upper parts of the creek have a sinuous path that could remind one of a snake. Not sure if those are right or not, but maybe. I'd also like to make a quick pitch for Wild Montana. We're a group formerly known as the Montana Wilderness Association that works to protect and preserve wild places and public lands in Montana, envisioning, we hope, a state where both people and wildlife flourish, in part because our public lands and waters are wild and connected. You can find out more about the group at wildmontana.org. Okay. So this talk is going to focus on the settlers and the history from sort of the late 1800s into the 1930s or so in what I'm calling the upper part of the Rattlesnake, which is above the main trailhead, so not the part that's heavily settled down below, but in the National Recreation Area. And I've found a number of interesting things up there. There are some artifacts from past farming histories, and also a number of structural remains, like this one. And I've been able to connect some of these using a master's thesis from the University of Montana to the names of the people who actually live there. And I find that combination of archaeology and history really kind of fascinating. And so I think it makes a good story, and it's a great resource. I first became interested in this, to answer Judy's question, when Bert Lindler showed me this set of structural remains, which are on the south side of Sawmill Gulch, maybe a mile or so above the Sawmill Gulch trailhead. And I didn't think a whole lot about it, although I thought it was pretty neat. There's also a structure that's a little more intact than this. But I was showing a couple of friends the site a year later, and somebody asked if I knew anything about the people who live there. And I said, well, no. But a Google search turned up that master's thesis from the university. And so I was able, and it was searchable. So I searched for Sawmill Gulch in the thesis, and fairly quickly decided that this site probably belonged to Ragnar and Anna Swanson. Ragnar was a Swede, Anna was of Swedish descent, but had been born in Montana and had lived down in the Lima area south of Dillon. And they married in the, well, early 1900s, and were on this property from around 1900 for Ragnar until sometime in the late 20s probably. So I knew a little bit about them, and then I dropped it. But last summer, our local chapter of Wild Montana decided to start offering some local walks. Wild Montana has a very extensive wilderness walk program and have for years. But we haven't really done local things, and we decided to do that sort of as a social thing and just a way for people to get a little involved and learn more about the group. And I had the idea of leading a walk into the Rattlesnake to look at the history. And my first thought was to go to this site. But then I thought I should go back and look at that thesis a little more carefully. And when I did, I discovered that there'd been a lot of settlement up the main Rattlesnake Valley and up some of the side gulches as well. And so I started poking around. And by the time the walk happened, I had only found a handful of sites. I've been up since then and found more. And there's a lot up there, so I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. I'm going to go forward here. So obviously, since I've only been here 5 years, I don't have any direct history with this stuff. And since everybody had pretty much moved out by the 1930s, I'm not old enough to have even been around back then. So my sources are primarily that thesis. Daniel Comer has a thesis that's got a huge amount of information in it. I've still got lots of stuff in there to look for. But that's the primary source. And in the thesis, he did walking surveys of part of the rattlesnake drainage. I've outlined it in blue, and then I couldn't draw blue lines, but follow the red lines down to where they connect to the blue. That's the area that he did walking surveys. And his goal was to walk transects 25 yards apart, looking for sites on the ground, and then he recorded what he found. And he ended up with a couple of hundred things that he found. Some of them just telephone poles, for example, but there's something on the order of 60 different sets of building remains that he found. And so there's quite a lot of stuff. If you don't know the geography, I expect most of you do, but the main trailhead is down here. And then Sawmill Gulch, where that first set of building remains is up off this way. Going upstream, Spring Gulch comes in from the left, and then Dry Gulch, which many of you have probably been up to the Curry cabin. That's up in that section of the drainage. And then up the main trail, the creek goes on and goes over a hillside up here, which is actually the terminal moraine of the glaciers that came down out of the Rattlesnake drainage back during the last ice age. And I hadn't heard this name before, but it's apparently was back then called the Hogback or the Hog's Back. And it's a fairly prominent feature. It'll show up again in a couple of the stories later on. Just above the Hogback is Poe Meadow, which many of you have probably been to. There's a second restroom up there for one thing, so it's a stop. And then beyond that, the valley keeps going for quite a ways. I'll show another map in a second that goes farther up. But this is the area that Comer surveyed, and he especially surveyed the lower, the old floodplain areas and terraces along the stream, and did some surveying up in the steeper country along the sides, but not nearly as much, I think. I didn't put the name on, but apparently this ridge line that sort of borders the creek on the west was called Strawberry Ridge at one point, and also called Wallman Ridge. If you've hiked up there, the Wallman Trail is this one that goes up from near the Hog's Back and then goes up and over and connects back up to the Spring Gulch Trail. You can make a nice loop of 7 or 8 miles, I think, something like that, up there. Comer did a lot of work, and I certainly relied heavily on what he had done. He spent a lot of time looking at property records, which I've only just barely touched on. I've tried to confirm a couple of things. He also alerted me to Forrest and Flossie Poe's memoir. Some of you may know about it. They published it in 1992. They printed 500 copies locally. There is a copy in the archives at the Mansfield Library on the university campus. So if you want to take a look, that's a place you can get a hold of it. I know at least one other, I know 2 people in town who have a copy too. But I've got the, well, I've also got a PDF version now that I've created. So that's a great resource. Forrest and Flossie were, well, Forrest was the son of Fred Poe, who was the original Poe of Poe Meadow. And he and Flossie married around 1930, I guess, and lived there for a few years. And I'll tell their story a little bit later on as well. But they have a lot of stories. It's about a 60-page manuscript. Has a lot of information about other residents in the valley. So it's certainly one of the sources for stories about these people as well. And then there are newspaper articles. And I think I had an easier time than Comer did. He makes a little note in the acknowledgments for the thesis. Sounded like one of his friends spent some time going through Missoulian pages finding things about the rattlesnake. But I suspect that at that time, 20 years ago, it wasn't digitized and maybe not searchable. And so I've now been able to search, and I think I've found some things that he may not have known about. So extra stories. And then census records are useful for some things, like finding out people's ancestry and where they were born and stuff like that, as well as other information. And then there's a book that was published that my friend Wolf gave me a couple months ago by Jim Harmon, who does a lot of historical stuff here in Missoula, I think, called The Sneakinest Man That Ever Lived. It was published in 2020, and he's got a great story in there about Coyote Bill Beescove. I've got some additional information too, but I certainly relied on that for that piece of things. So those are the stories, I guess. And yeah. Oh, I was going to say that these tales, I think one of the things I find especially interesting about all this is that we're kind of looking at the history of ordinary people. You know, these are not senators and congressmen and presidents and things like that. They're just people who are living off the land and making a living there. But at the same time, what we've actually got to talk about is coming out of the newspaper. And So it's not necessarily the most, well, things that get into the newspaper tend to be related to unusual events. If you've been sued by somebody or if you've committed a crime, that might get in the paper, or if you find a dead body. And so there's a number of dead body stories coming up. And so I will point out that the stories are underrepresentative of women, for example, and also of your sort of quiet, ordinary citizens who just sort of went around their business and didn't get into trouble in one way or another. But they're still interesting stories. Okay, let's see if I can make this work from up here. I'm just going to go with this. So I wanted to give just a quick overview of some of the important events in the history of the area to get us started. And the first real use by European settlers in the Upper Rattlesnake, I think, was in the early 1880s. Thomas Greenough, who later donated the Greenough Park in town and had a mansion there that I've now learned is the Keep restaurant up in the South Hills at this point, I think. He got a contract from the Northern Pacific to provide ties for the railroad that was coming through, and that line was completed, many of you probably know, in the early 1880s. Even after the railroad was done, he did more logging up there. He had a small dam, apparently, up near the hogback, and he would collect logs up there and then float them down in the spring. After the tie business was done, he floated lumber, cordwood, down, because one of the early activities that was pretty prominent was cutting wood and using it to supply people in Missoula with firewood. So Greenough was one of the early people doing things up there. The first dam was built on the creek at roughly the location of the dam that was just removed a couple years ago in the very early 1900s, and then a concrete dam replaced it in the 1920s. And the creek has been Missoula's water source for quite a long time. And that certainly plays a role in the story as well. So I wanted to mention that. In 1919, there was a major fire that swept through the Rattlesnake. And this was human-caused. According to Poe, Charlie Quast, who had a farm over in the Grant Creek side, was burning straw. It was in August, and things were probably pretty dry. And apparently there were strong winds from the west. The fire burned up over the Grant Creek divide into the Sawmill and Spring Gulches, down into the main creek. And Poe says it went all the way as far as Lake Placid, which is pretty impressive. So it was a major fire. There was a major evacuation of people in the Rattlesnake. Most of the families got out in one way or another, although a number of the residents stayed to try and save their property, and some were successful. Let's see. I'm trying to think where I wanted to go here. Okay, so the fire went through. A number of people were herded out. I guess Emma Poe and some of the Poe children, this is from a different Poe family, but we'll get to that later, sort of walked out from up above the hog's back wrapped in woolen blankets, and then were eventually taken out by car when they got close to the end. The elderly wife of Sebastian Effinger, who we'll talk about in a second, was German and only spoke German. She got taken out by car, but made such a ruckus that the sheriff brought her back, even though the Effinger property was surrounded on 3 sides by the fire. I guess there were also 10 firefighters, because in the end, I think the Forest Service, which was fairly new at that point, had roughly 40 hired firefighters at the peak trying to battle the blaze and contain it. And at one point, I guess 10 of the firefighters got caught up in Spring Gulch, but they managed to follow the fire down. So they came down after it burned through the area and got out okay. So I don't think anybody was killed, but several homes were burned, and a couple of them at least were not rebuilt. I was also going to mention at this point, and this is what I was trying to remember, one of the more unusual things that was up in that Upper Rattlesnake area at one point, and it got started just a couple of years before the fire, there was something called the Montana Silver Black Fox Farm Company, or Fox Company. And they were up in that upper area, a couple miles above the main trailhead, for a few years. And at first, they only had, I think it was 8 pairs of breeding foxes. And there was some big concern about whether or not the foxes had survived the fire. But it turned out that they had burrows that went several feet underground, and they had gone into the burrows and they came out and they were just fine. Even in 1919, if the Missoulian is right, those foxes were worth $20,000, which seems like an awful lot of money for back then. So pretty impressive. And then the fox farm moved within a few years, sometime in the 20s, I think. They moved down a little ways into the lower part of the Rattlesnake. And if you've been in that Lincoln Woods section of town, there is a fox farm road, which I'm assuming is in the vicinity of where they relocated. And I think it was after they relocated, there was an article in the Missoulian about how there was a lawsuit. Somebody nearby was suing the fox farm for several $100s over the loss of 110 chickens that had been that had been killed by the guard dogs on the fox farm. Apparently at that time they were Airedales, although the first story I found said that they had a couple of Great Danes as guard dogs to start out with. But it turned out that the guy who lost the chickens then shot the dogs, and so the fox farm sued back. I think in the end, the guy who lost the chickens got awarded $50 or something. It wasn't a very big settlement. But anyway, Forrest Poe says that after the fire, one of the ranchers who got burned out sat up above the Quast Ranch on Grant Creek with a rifle for a couple of weeks, hoping to get a shot at him, but never did apparently. And I guess Charlie was eventually able to move back to the ranch and without any further repercussions. This is a big event in the history of the valley. In 1935 and 36, the Montana Power Company, who owned the dam and so was responsible for the water supply in town, bought out the remaining ranchers up above Sawmill Gulch in order to preserve the quality of the water. And they gave the people a year to get out what they wanted to take. And then they destroyed the structures. I think they probably burned them, although I'm not 100% sure. I've not seen that in writing anywhere, but it seems likely. So most of the structures were gone at that point, although obviously they didn't burn that one up in Sawmill Gulch that I had seen first, because there was a fair amount of wood there, which has made me wonder whether they bought the land up Sawmill Gulch or not. I'm not entirely sure. So they bought places out in 1936, and as a result, ever since, they've been kind of sitting there, and it's a historical, I like to call it an outdoor museum. So that's kind of neat. And then in the early 1980s, and some of you maybe were around at the time, the National Recreation Area and the Rattlesnake Wilderness were established, and things changed. The land was transferred to the Forest Service. I think Poe says that the power company was traded some land in eastern Montana in exchange that had some coal potential, and so they had an interest in doing that. And so that brings us up to roughly the present time in terms of ownership. And then I made a little graph based on data from the thesis. Here's roughly the population of the Upper Rattlesnake over time. So basically nobody before 1880, a peak between sort of 1910 and the early to mid 1920s, although there was a bit of a dip during World War I as well. And then the population had started to go down quite a bit by 1930, probably a result of the Depression, because prices, Poe talks about this a little bit in the memoir, prices for agricultural goods just fell through the floor, and so people couldn't make money, and so they moved out of the area. They weren't able to farm the way they had. And then they're gone certainly by 1936 or 1937, and since then there's been no permanent habitation up there. Comer also provides a different way of looking at it a little bit in the thesis, which I think is worth mentioning. He identifies 4 sort of significant time periods in the history of the area. The earliest from the 1880s, and for a while, was the logging and the wood production. That remained a source of income for people who were subsistence farming up in the valley, up until the teens at least. So that's the first. In the second, there was a bit of a phase of mining interest, which I won't have a whole lot to say about, although I will mention one thing a little later on. that lasted from maybe 1885 to 1900 or so. And so there were a number of pits dug, and people did some exploratory drilling or blasting into the hillside looking for valuable things. The third time period was the period of people moving in to do subsistence farming, to homestead. And that was sort of peaking, starting in the late 1800s and continuing up until World War I or so at least. And then the final episode was that after World War I, people started to come up with other sources of income besides just subsistence farming and maybe hauling wood into town. So they started maybe doing farming with the intent of selling things to town, or they started commuting into town. So they'd live up in the Rattlesnake and go into town to work and then come back home. So several different, somewhat distinct episodes there. Okay, and so here's a map from the back of Forrest and Flossie Poe's memoir, showing the creek again with some of the habitation sites identified on the map. And we're mostly going to be looking at the lower part here, in particular, partly because I just haven't had that much time yet. Inside the red circle, even there I haven't found all the sites that are noted, but I've also found a couple that aren't there but are talked about in the thesis. But I do want you to notice that Parker site way up the Rattlesnake. That's essentially at the end of the modern road, I think, roughly 15 miles up from the main trailhead. And one of the stories involves what I think is probably that cabin, or at least someplace up near it. So we're going to be focused in this area, just above the Rattlesnake trailhead. And the slides are nice, but I encourage people to get out and look for yourselves too. It's fun to go and see these things in person. Let's see, okay. So how many people have seen this spot? I'm guessing quite a few, okay? Yeah, like half. So this is one of the more impressive little sites. This is just a short ways up Spring Creek, but it's off the trail a little ways. There's a trail that cuts across between the ones that go up on either side of the creek. And this is right near the creek. And it's a chimney, and that's about all that's there, although there are some other things nearby, some depressions apparently that I haven't found. And this site was occupied by George and Margaret Duncan for a time. George, I believe, was from the Shetland Islands in Scotland, and Margaret was from Glasgow. They didn't know each other before they got to the US. They married in North Dakota, and they had arrived in Missoula by 1888. So they were among the earliest settlers in the area. And I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that Duncan Drive, which goes up along the west side of the creek, is named for them. Seems likely. There was a younger George, and one of the stories I found, so here's the first dead body, involved George Jr., although he wasn't actually Jr. because his middle name was different, so I don't think that applies. But when he was a teenager, roughly 15, he was involved in a gun accident. He and a couple of his friends had gone up camping up above the Franklin Bridge, and they were several miles up there. And George apparently was passing a gun, which he may not have realized was loaded, but it was, to his friend Clarence Williams. And the gun went off, and Clarence didn't die immediately, but they were trying to get him back down to the Franklin homestead, and he died on the way there. So it was a pretty serious wound. So that was pretty early on in 1906. George ended up going on to be an engineer, and he enlisted in the Army during World War I and was in an engineering troop. He sent back a copy of a newsletter from his ship to his dad that made it into the newspaper. And he said something along the lines of, he'd much rather read about taking a ship across the Atlantic than actually doing it, which seems appropriate. George Duncan owned a fair amount of land up there, and he was the one who donated an acre of land for the school, which turned out to be an important feature of that Upper Rattlesnake area for a couple of decades or more. I'll say a little bit more about that later because there's a story involved. And then Margaret died pretty early. in 1914. George moved into town shortly after that. So by the time of the fire in 1919, they were no longer living up there. And according to Poe, their place burned in the 1919 fire and was never rebuilt. George ended up being a road supervisor, a game warden, a deputy sheriff. He shows up in the paper a number of times, including one occasion, I should probably save this for later, but where he had to go up and tell Coyote Bill. Coyote Bill is going to be a big part of this, but not until the end. That he had to stop blocking the road and keeping people from going farther up the Rattlesnake beyond his place, because he was very territorial. Anyway, George got into the paper for confronting Bill Beescove. Okay. One of the first places I found, and one that's pretty obvious. How many people have seen this one? Quite a few, okay. It's not right on one of the main trails, but if you just go on a short spur over to the stream, these bridge abutments are quite obvious. And it turns out that these are on the property, or were on the property of Sebastian Effinger, who was, again, one of the earliest settlers in the area. He owned land on both sides of the creek. His house was actually over on the east side of the creek, but a lot of his fields were over on the west side, where there's a more extensive floodplain. And so he had a bridge built so that he could access the fields on the west side. He and his sons actually built the bridge. Whoops. He had two sons, and it's a little unclear which one was older. I'm pretty sure that Lewis was older, but on the other hand, well, I found something that suggests that Lewis was born in 1874, and his younger brother Charles, not for several years after that, 1877, I think. But on Lewis's grave, which is in the Missoula Cemetery, it says 1879, which would make him the younger brother, so not sure. But in any case, the two boys and Sebastian built the bridge originally, probably sometime in the late 1800s, although that's not real clear either. The earliest reference I found to it in the Missoulian is not until around 1910 or so, but I suspect that it was quite a bit earlier. And the bridge abutments, there's one on each side. There's some wing walls on this side. They're pretty impressive. It turns out the abutments, I didn't know this in July, but the abutments were actually constructed in 1917 or 18. The county took over ownership of the bridge at that point, or maybe before, and they rebuilt the bridge with the concrete abutments. I think the original bridge was just wooden. And the bridge lasted for a long time, and I'm not sure of all the details here either, but there was a story in the Missoulian in 1948 that the bridge collapsed when a truck with a bulldozer on the back was crossing the bridge, and the bridge collapsed. Luckily, the bulldozer was on hand, and so they were able to grade a route down to the stream so that vehicles that were on the other side could get back across. And I'm not sure if it was rebuilt after that or not, but there is something in the Comer thesis that suggests that it was washed out in 1953. So if it was rebuilt after 1948, it didn't last much longer than that. And after that, the bridge down on Sawmill Gulch Road has become, I guess, the main access for that entire area. The guy driving the truck with the bulldozer sued the county because he claimed, and he was probably right, that there'd been a report, an engineering report about the bridge saying it was unsafe and the timbers were rotting. And so he was driving across. I guess he was hauling Christmas trees. It was in November that it collapsed. And so he sued for loss of income, repairs to the truck, and so on. And I think he got something, but anyway. The Effingers also had a pretty impressive ditch. And if you've walked up there much, you'll have seen the ditch, although I had never realized just what it was. But it was an irrigation ditch intended to bring water from up Rattlesnake Creek a ways down to their fields on the east side of the creek. So the ditch itself, in places, this is a spot where it's fairly obvious and fairly clear, but it's only a couple of feet deep. There are places farther up where it's as much as 5 or 6 feet deep. And it's a little tough to follow it all the way, but I've gone pretty much all the way up to where it enters from the creek at this point. It's about 3/4 of a mile where there's a well-defined ditch. And then from the point where it ends, apparently, there was a wooden flume that carried the water and actually crossed over the creek, like 15 feet above the creek or something like that, and took the water over to the east side for them to irrigate with. The ditch was, of course, a reason for lawsuits, too. In one of the earliest lawsuits in about 1900, I think it was, it's reported that Chapman and Effinger had actually come to blows over the water rights related to the ditch. And Chapman sued Effinger, and the final thing said that Chapman was awarded $30 or something like that, but that probably each party had spent over $200 on the legal battle, which would have been a lot of money back then. There was also a case where Effinger sued somebody because they weren't allowing him access to the ditch to make repairs and things, because he built the ditch across other people's land. And in fact, the last lawsuit I saw, Effinger filed a lawsuit to get the ditch condemned, I think with the goal of avoiding future litigation related to other people saying it had damaged their property and so on. And so I guess that got settled. But yeah, it's quite a ditch. And there are others, of course, too. You might, how many people know the Quast ditch? So a few, because the Quast, there were two Quast brothers, Charlie and Otto. Otto had a place down in the Rattlesnake lower down. And the Quast ditch is an impressive one that goes quite a long ways down into that Lincoln Hills area. And then Charlie was the one who started the fire on the other side over in Grant Creek. Sebastian died in 1916, and Lewis took over the farm, but then died in 1921. And so the Effingers were out of that area by the early 1920s, and the Ray family took over and operated a dairy at that location for a long time. I was going to mention, too, that Louis Effinger, well, the Effingers were very German. And during World War I, I guess they were regarded with a lot of suspicion. And in fact, Sebastian Effinger may have been one of the earliest, if not the earliest, maybe the only, I don't know, in Montana to be accused of sedition. He was downtown, corner of Main and Higgins, and somebody was reading a newspaper article about the Germans having captured a bunch of people someplace, and Lewis made a comment that sounded pro-German, probably was. Sounded like he was about to get lynched, but he got arrested instead by the local policeman. He was charged with sedition, convicted, and fined $800 in 1919. But okay, let's see. Oh, yep. Just a little ways above the bridge, if you've done that walk at all, you've probably noticed these stones in the trail. And that marks the site, that's the porch for the old Upper Rattlesnake School. The school building itself is shown there, and that's one of the photos from the Poe memoir. So that you can kind of see that the back part of the building is a little different than the front. They added the cloakroom and also a swing set and outhouses 5 or 6 years after the building was originally constructed. And the porch, which you can also see there a little bit, would have been sitting right on top of these stones, which would have been the foundation. There's also a trail going down to the stream from just out in front of the school that's still kind of there. You can follow it. And Duncan donated land for the school, but it turns out that later on, long after the fact, I think in the mid to late 19-teens, a real estate developer named Odin Orr from Missoula bought the land that Duncan had owned and some other places as well. And in researching it, he discovered that the transfer of land to the school had never been legalized. They didn't have any actual legal right to it. And so he charged them, Poe thinks it was $300, something like that, to get their 1 acre of land for the schoolhouse.
Where was that located?
Do you know where the, there's a restroom about a half mile up from the main trailhead? Just before you get to that restroom, there's a trail going off to the right. If you go down that a little ways, there's a trail coming in from the right that joins it. And just up maybe 50 yards from there, on the left is where the schoolhouse was. Yeah. It was just a one-room school. They typically had about 20 students. There were apparently 2 rows of desks and a stove in the middle, and the teacher's desk up in front. One year, sometime in the mid-1920s, I think, was their peak enrollment. And they had as many as, I think it was 39 students, which is a little hard to imagine getting into that space. It was 25 by 18 feet, roughly speaking. So it's not a huge school by any means. Frank Burton, who had a home just 100 yards north of the school, I guess it would be, was the caretaker for many years and sort of a watchman. And he was paid $5 a month for doing that. He also often worked for George Duncan, because he was on the Duncan land at first, at least. And he also found a dead body. So one day, sometime, let me see. Well, it was before he died, obviously. He died in 1916. So sometime in the early 1900s, he was going to go to Bonner, and he had just left home and was headed down, and he found a horse and wagon just sitting there just across Effinger Bridge. And the horse wasn't doing anything, and there was no person obviously there, and the reins were kind of dangling below. And so he poked around, and there was the body in the back of the wagon. Apparently, a guy named McCarthy had been drinking pretty heavily in Missoula the night before. Several people had seen him heading back up the valley in the next morning and kind of leaning over and wobbling. And when the sheriff investigated, they determined that the reins had been dragging for about a half mile before the spot where the wagon had stopped. Apparently the horse was used to getting some water where they crossed the bridge, and so the horse had stopped there waiting for water and didn't get any, but found him. So anyway. And it looks like the school was a focus of community life. For one thing, many of the people who lived in the valley were involved with the school in one way or another. Quite a few were on the school board. Quite a few had children who attended the school. And there were, so they had parties and things for the kids. There was a note in the paper in 1929 that the school was closing a month early because they ran out of funding for the school. Apparently they had a hard time getting teachers for this school because it was kind of remote. And they had only an 8-month year instead of a 9-month year. The teachers often ended up boarding with residents that lived fairly close to the school. And I think during the school was active from 1907 to 1930. During that time, 23 years roughly, they had at least 30 different teachers. So some only lasted a few months. I think the record, somebody stayed 2 or 3 years. So it was not the easiest job, probably. After the school closed in 1930, it was still used as a polling place for a few years at least. And Poe talks about having hard times dances at the school. I'm assuming this was after the Depression had started, where people would bring something for refreshments and so on. Everybody would bring a little something. He said they usually brought a little cream for the coffee. And people would chip in a nickel or something for the band, which was just some of the local folks. But it sounds like the school was really kind of a center of social life in the valley, and so was a major institution. Oh, sometimes it's a little slow. Above the school, maybe a quarter mile or so, are some foundations that are right along the trail, and one of them in particular is very obvious. This is not that one, but if you look hard, you might be able to pick out the foundation there. There's some straight lines there and over there. These were a couple of places that were owned by Robert Neely, who was an Irishman. He was born in the US, but his parents were from Ireland. And he apparently went back to Ireland to marry. And I'm not quite sure what happened there. I'm sure there's a good story behind it, but I don't know it. His wife immigrated in 1895, and their daughter immigrated in 1895. So I'm guessing he may have gone back to Ireland, lived there for a few years, got married, had a couple of kids, then came back to the US. One big puzzle is that in the 1910 census, his son is shown as having immigrated in 1891, But if you do the math, the son wasn't born until 1893, so that doesn't seem right. So guessing that they might have all immigrated in 1895, but I'm not sure what was going on there. So this is one of the Neely spots. At this location, there are two foundations fairly close together. And then there are some more extensive building remains a little downstream from that site. The one on the left is the most obvious one of all, I think, as you're just walking along the trail. It's got a couple of foundation walls that stick up a foot or so, and so you can see it pretty clearly. There's also this nice little ring of stones out in front, right here, which Comer thinks was just a flower garden, perhaps. And there's a number of other things nearby. But one of the more interesting things in the lower part of the area is actually hidden in the bushes over on this side, just beyond this foundation. When there are leaves on the bushes, you're not going to see it unless you're really looking hard. If you go in the fall, when the leaves have come off, it's a little more obvious, but still not super obvious. But there's a little dugout structure here with rock-lined walls and a doorway that still has some of the framing for the door in place. And out in front of the door, there are the remains of what Comer has identified as a stove, which are the metal pieces that you're seeing here and here. So that's kind of a neat spot, and hidden right down in the bank, dug into the side of the terrace at that location. One of the things that I didn't realize for a long time were part of the Comer thesis are some site maps. And here's the one for the lower site where, I'm getting there. Here's the little dugout with the stove. So it's about 11 feet by 12 feet, stove out in front, cut into the side of the bank. You'll notice the Effinger Ditch is right near this location as well. The bigger foundation that has the more obvious walls is back in here, and here's the stone circle, and there are several concrete slabs there that are pretty obvious and easy to find too. Here's another foundation a little farther upstream, very close to the ditch. And then down on the terrace, down below these upper foundations, there's another foundation down here. And there's a little bit of a dump. Well, I guess that's the D. There's something that maybe is an automobile seat or maybe a bed spring, I'm not quite sure, along the trail there that's pretty obvious too. Oh, and notice up here in the top, there's a sign on a tree. So here's the sign. It's almost all there. It basically says the waters are closed to fishing, and I'm assuming that's the Montana Fish and Game Commission. I looked up, and the name didn't change to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks until pretty late. So this doesn't really offer much information about how old the sign is, but certainly looks fairly old. So. Okay, I don't have much to say about this place, but it's one of the more obvious ones along the trail. So I thought I'd at least mention it. It's a fairly deep cellar hole of some sort with a fairly deep entryway on the side closest to the trail. And Comer thinks this is one of the earliest sites in the area, probably dating back into maybe even the 1880s, but certainly the 1890s. One early settler in the area was McClellan, and he might actually have lived at this location. He might also have lived in that little dugout that I showed at the last site. That was a possibility. And Neely may have lived there for a while, because I think the Neelys weren't very well off early on. There were a couple of stories about liens on cordwood that he had cut or him owing rent and things like that. Poe says the Aarons had 3 children who went to the Upper Rattlesnake School. In the 1910 census, only 2 were listed. And it turns out in the census that the 2 children who are listed have the last name Roberts. And it also identifies in the census that Mr. and Mrs. Aarons, this was both their second marriage. They'd only been married for a few years at the time. So I'm guessing that the kids were actually from Mrs. Aarons' first marriage. And at the time she and Aarons married, they were in their teens. Only 2 of them were in the 1910 census. The other one had probably already moved away. He would have been in the older teens. And in addition to this, and I didn't take a photo, it wasn't easy to get photo, there are a couple of sections of stone wall just a little ways away from this cellar hole, and also a smaller depression that was maybe a root cellar or something else. Okay. Oh, boy, it really is slow. So one of the more tragic stories, I think, has to do with the Wallman family. And if you've hiked out there, you'll know the Wallman Trail, and so this is named for them. John and Mary Wallman both immigrated from Sweden, and they arrived in the US in 1888. They got to Montana very quickly because they had land near the hogback as early as 1890 and owned a fair amount up there. The homestead site, I think, is this one, where really it's just a place that was dug out into the side of the hill, a little ground heating, I guess, for one thing. So there's nothing too much to see, but there are some things in the area. A little ways away, there's a metal band here hanging on a tree, and there are a number of places where metal bands like this have been found. My best guess is that these are barrel hoops that were holding barrels together. And apparently during Prohibition in the 20s, there were a number of stills up in the Rattlesnake. Forrest says he knew of at least a half a dozen. And so maybe these bands are related to kegs that they were holding alcohol in, not sure. This is also the only place I think that I've seen where there's a ceramic pot. It's broken, but it's there on the ground right in the homestead site. And then some other, there's lots of, if you poke around off the trail, there's lots of metal laying around in the woods, mostly cans and things, but some other things that are a little more interesting as well. So I said it was a tragic story, and I guess there's several pieces to that. One is that Mary Wallman died, apparently of lung problems. That's from a Find a Grave site, so I'm not sure how accurate it is because anybody could have put it up. I tried to get her death certificate from the county clerk, but they can't find anything, so not sure. But she died pretty early in 1906. She was quite young, only in her 20s, I think. And she was also tried for insanity. I guess that means somebody attempted to have her committed. I don't know if that would have been her husband or who. I'm sure there's a story there too, but I don't know that one either. At the time she died, they had two young daughters who were only 3 and 4 in 1906. And they apparently went to live with the Swansons, the people that had that first cabin site up Sawmill Gulch. The Swansons were also Swedish, so I suspect that that was part of the link, is maybe they spoke Swedish at home, not sure. So Mary had a pretty difficult time. John was accused of timber theft a couple of times. His main occupation appears to have been cutting wood and hauling it into town for people to use as firewood. And here's another body. One of the guys who worked for him was John, says Hamling in the paper, but I'm pretty sure it's Hammerly, based on a couple of things. Hammerly had a cabin site not too far from the Wallman homestead, and apparently John employed him to cut wood. Whether he was found at the cabin site near the homestead or someplace a little farther up above the Hogsback, I'm not sure. But I guess John hadn't seen him in a couple weeks. There'd been a big snowstorm. He went by the cabin where he expected Hammerly to be, didn't see any tracks around it or anything, and didn't see any smoke coming out of the chimney, so thought he'd probably gone into town. Went into town to check on him, found no trace of him, went back to the cabin, shoveled out the snow, broke in, and there he was. And this is a tragic story too, because apparently he committed suicide. They said there was no food in the cabin, so, and I guess he had told people that he didn't know why he kept on living, so he was probably, they described it as weary of life, and probably hungry. And one of the details they said was that he had covered the barrel of the gun with a can, and their explanation for that was that he didn't want to get powder stains or powder burns on his clothing. I guess that's a seriously frugal kind of guy. Anyway, another body. And then John had a sad end as well. He was struck by a Northern Pacific train in Milltown in 1916 and died. And Ragnar Swanson sued the railroad, I assume on behalf of the girls, because they still would have been in their teens at the time. But he lost the suit. It was dismissed. The court weighed in that if John had been reasonably careful, he would have noticed the train coming and not gotten run over. And And I've kind of wondered if it might have been suicide, because he had been having problems. The daughters were living elsewhere. Didn't seem like he had a very good life, so I don't know. But anyway, nothing ended up very well. Right near the Wallman homestead, I've found another site, and this is a major site. It's got some really interesting features. It'll take a second or two. This is the biggest pile of rocks I've found up the Rattlesnake. It's like 60 or 70 feet long, as much as 4 or 5 feet high, up to 15 or 20 feet wide. And I had no idea what was going on with this. It seemed like an anomaly, but I may have an explanation. I'm not sure about this, but apparently the DeSmet Irrigation Company owned this land after Wallman died in the early 1920s. And they apparently were interested in building a dam at the Hog's Back, which would be a natural dam location because the stream narrows down quite a bit there. And it may be that they were piling up stone in preparation for building a dam, but they ran out of funding apparently, and so nothing ever happened. But it's kind of a weird spot just out in the woods with this huge pile of stone, much bigger than anything you'd expect for just piling up stones to avoid having your field filled up with stone. Yeah. Okay, so we're getting there. A couple more. This is probably the neatest cellar hole. It's maybe a root cellar that I've found, and it's pretty good sized and neatly lined with stone. This was a property that belonged to Mark and Emma Poe. They later moved farther up the valley, but between about 1906 and 1914, they lived at this location, probably. And right next to the root cellar, there's also a raised area that's probably the foundation for the actual home. This is probably just storage. But also nearby, there are the remains of a vehicle chassis down here in the lower left, and what I think is probably the base for an oil lamp over here on the right. So a little more unusual kinds of stuff to find in the woods. They lived in this area. They had 5 kids. All 5 went to the Upper Rattlesnake School. One of their kids, Gail Poe, was one of the last students at the school. In 1930, there were only 3 students, and so after that, they closed down entirely. And Gail was one of the last ones. And then I'm going to tell you the abbreviated version of this story. The Missoulian printed a long story in 1907 about Mark and his brother Fred and their encounter with a bear. So they were down in August of 1907 picking huckleberries about 3 miles below the Hogback, which would put them somewhere between the main trailhead and the dam. And it was a great day for picking huckleberries. And then they heard woof, woof. And Fred said, bear. And Mark said, 2 bears. And so they investigated, and there were 2 bear cubs up the tree. And they were thinking those bear cubs looked pretty tasty, and the fur looked pretty nice. And so Mark said, I'm going to run back home and get the gun. You stay here and keep the bears up the tree. So at this point in the story, my first thought was probably the same as yours, which is what? But apparently this is before people learned that. Because Fred said, okay, I'll stay and keep the bears up the tree. And according to the story in the paper, Fred was taunting the bears with their helplessness. He even went so far as to remove a sapling that was dead underneath the limb that they were on, thinking that they might mess up the fur if they fell on it. And so he's having a good time just keeping the bears up the tree until he hears woof, woof, woof. And here comes the mother bear, and suddenly it's not Fred keeping the bears up the tree, it's the mother bear chasing Fred around, and he eventually made a leap for a limb, climbed up into the tree and got away. And after 10 minutes or so of woofing, the mother bear apparently talked the cubs into coming down the tree, and they had taken off. But when Mark got back with the gun, Fred was still up the tree. And they didn't get any bears. So this was a story that didn't have a dead body in it. That's good. So Poe Meadow, which many of you have been to, was originally Fred and Julia Poe. And Fred was born in Kentucky, grew up in Minnesota at Cannon Falls, not too far south of the Twin Cities, where I'm from, and then took a variety of jobs coming across and ended up in Montana by the late 1800s. He and Mark were both in the area in 1899 or so, and Poe says that they worked quarrying stone on Mount Jumbo for one of the buildings in town. But then Mark Poe went to Great Falls for a while and eventually came back. But Fred stayed. I guess he picked up, I think it was typhoid, which he recovered from while he was working in the 9 Mile logging for the Forest Service. And while he was in the hospital, he got to talking with one of the other guys in the hospital, and they had seen a newspaper story, and they thought that the hogback was going to be a really important spot for land because it was a natural dam site, and that land up above the dam site might be very valuable. So when he got out of the hospital, he went up and found some willing sellers up there, I think probably because of Bill Beescove. And so he purchased a couple of properties up above the hogback, which is where Poe Meadow is, and his family was there for the next 35 years. There is a site, and I haven't done a lot of exploring in that area, but there is a fairly obvious site. I think it may be a cellar hole that's become a dump, or maybe it was just a dump. But I discovered that if you go back at the right time of year, there's more there. So in this batch of trees over here, when the leaves are gone, there's the head frame of a bed, I think, and then a saw blade that's kind of woven through it, and a couple of things hanging in a bucket and so on. And there's some other stuff out there too, rock walls and a variety of things. Let's see. Okay. So around 1914, Mark and Emma Poe moved up beyond Fred Poe's place, beyond Poe Meadow, on the other side of the road, to this site. And I haven't found much in the way of building remains here, but there are fruit trees, and there are iris, and there are lilacs. And I'm looking forward to going out in the spring and seeing if the lilacs and the iris are blooming. We'll see what happens. Shortly after the Poes moved up there, the teacher, I guess, was boarding with Mrs. Elric, and I'm not sure where that was, but Mrs. Elric evicted her for being too familiar with the husband, or vice versa, one or the other. And that led to the school closing for almost a year. Forrest said he didn't go to school for a while, and his uncle Mark got the job driving the kids from the Rattlesnake down to the Lincoln School, which many of you probably know. It's on Lolo Street. It's now, I guess, condos or something. I'm not quite sure what. But Mark got the job driving the kids down, and that led to a big feud between the Poe families. I guess up until that time, Fred Poe's family and Mark Poe's family had done quite a bit of socializing. They only lived about a mile apart, and they were cousins. But Mark liked the job driving the kids down into town so much that he was lobbying for the school just not to be reopened at all and just to have the kids go down there. And Fred said, no, the kids ought to be going to school closer to home so they can walk. They don't need to be carted all the way down into town. And so they disagreed about that. And apparently it led to a major feud, and the families stopped visiting much after that, which is a shame. Another dead body, okay. Well, just quickly, Mark Poe and his son, at Forrest's suggestion, perhaps, I guess Forrest was doing some trapping up in the upper part of the Rattlesnake in the late 1920s, and somebody else moved in on his territory, and they pretty much avoided each other. But in the January of 1930, I guess it was, Alan, who was staying with McKay, and they were both doing some trapping, I guess, had apparently fallen through the ice on a creek and gotten badly frostbitten on his feet. And McKay had found him and had arranged to get him into town. And he was in the hospital. There was concern that he might lose both feet, although the doctor seemed to think not. And then, a couple weeks later, McKay hadn't shown up. I guess he was in the habit of visiting the pose every couple of weeks or something. He didn't show up, and so they went up to check. And his cabin was sitting there looking unused. They went in, and it appeared that he had cut himself with his axe and probably bled to death. And he'd been there frozen maybe since just a day or two after he had taken Alan into the hospital. So one more dead body. Okay. The pose sold out to Montana Power. How many of you have seen the car? Only a few, okay. So at this upper pose site, I haven't found building remains, but there are a number of other things, including the most intact vehicle that I've found so far, probably the most intact one. I'm not sure what it is exactly, a Model A or something. But it's sitting out there in the field, not too far off the road, actually. Okay. So we get to Coyote Bill. This photo is taken from the Harmon book that I mentioned, and I think came out of the Anaconda newspaper back at the time. So that's Coyote Bill. He's often referred to as Colonel, claimed to have been a scout for Custer, not at the Little Bighorn, I presume, and to have been married 5 times. I can't verify the 5, but I have found 3 records of divorce in the county courthouse here, all within a period of a few years, and at least one within a month or 2 of the marriage. I suspect that the marriages were correspondence marriages, and when they arrived on scene and saw Coyote Bill and lived with him for a little while, they wanted nothing to do with it because he was a pretty ornery character. So I've seen a couple of explanations for where he got the name Coyote Bill. Poe says it refers to the coyote being the most cowardly animal there is, okay? And the Harmon book suggests that it's because the coyote is because Coyote Bill is the sneakingest man that ever was. But I came across a thing in the Missoulian back in 1901 that I think may be an alternative explanation that might actually be even better. So the last sentence here says, yesterday's trip for Coyote Bill coming into town was for the purpose of securing supplies to commence a campaign of coyote poisoning, in which line of sport Colonel Bill has no superior in western Montana, and as he claims, in the state. And at that time, predators, you could get a bounty, you could collect a bounty. I think the bounty for coyotes was $2, and for wolves and mountain lions it was $5, and Coyote Bill was apparently excellent at getting bounties on coyotes. So I suspect that that's the origin of the name. The first time he shows up in the Missoulian, really, and he shows up more than anybody else. In the 10 or 20 year period that I was searching for, I found roughly 100 references to Coyote Bill. There's Coyote Bill's coming into town to provide strawberries or huckleberries, or he's in a fight with a neighbor about something or other, or he's blocking the road and it has to be opened, all kinds of things. The nearest rival for that is somebody maybe 10 times. So it's like 10 times anybody else. So he was clearly a well-known character in town. The first thing that I've come across is from 1894, and he didn't come across very well. There was a young man from town, Newton Bonner, who'd been staying with him for a little while and had gone off hunting. It was in the wintertime. And Coyote Bill said he had gone off hunting, and then Coyote Bill heard a shot, but he hadn't really investigated. And then he made up a variety of stories which probably weren't true, because eventually the parents had sent somebody out to look for Bonner. And Coyote Bill was coming into town at the time and told him, well, he thought maybe he'd come back into town. He wasn't sure. He had in a few days. So they sent up a search party, and the search party was able to follow Newton's tracks from Coyote Bill's cabin, and presumably Coyote Bill hadn't gone too. Yes, whoops. But I'm running over a little bit too, my apologies. Maybe it shuts off after a second. Maybe it's a hint. Oh, yeah. that do it? How about now? I'll try to shout. That'll be good. Oh, I could try it, I suppose. Oh, I think the battery's gone. It's red. That's probably
Red is
it.
not a good sign.
Yeah.
That's green.
Okay. Does this work? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, the search party went up, was able to follow Newton's tracks away from the cabin, and about a mile from the cabin, they found him frozen and dead. Apparently, he'd been using his rifle as a walking stick, and when he shoved it into the snow, it discharged and shot him in the head. But the newspaper, on the first occasion when there was a report in the paper, they gave Coyote Bill a hard time because it had been like 4 or 5 days since the kid had gone away from the cabin, and he had not apparently gone to look for him or gotten a search party or anything. But Coyote Bill apparently got the newspaper pretty regularly and was pretty quick about responding, because in the next day's paper, it says, Mr. Coyote Bill Briscoe takes exception to the Missoulians' reference to his conduct in the matter of the disappearance of Bonner Newton, and has threatened to wipe out the entire staff and all the other beautiful things. On one occasion, somebody tried to get Coyote Bill declared insane, but the court found that he wasn't insane, just very argumentative and inclined to be a pain in the neck. So anyway. One of the stories about Coyote Bill is that he drove off the 3 Swedes. The 3 Swedes had opened a mine just north of the Hog's Back in the late 1880s, between 1885 and 1889. Apparently the adit went back in almost 100 feet into the hillside. And Coyote Bill informed them when they decided they maybe had found something worthwhile, that he owned all the mineral and timber rights in the Upper Rattlesnake, which was not true. They didn't want to believe it, and they said they weren't going to give him half, which is what he was asking for. But apparently he came down with his gun and shot off some of the stones on their chimney. And whether it was because of that or because of not finding all that much that was valuable, they decided to stop working the mine, and it was never worked again afterwards. Although Sebastian Effinger bought the rights to the mine shortly after they left. But I have been able to find the mine site. There's a flat area here of tailings, and then a ramp going up, and the mine site is right in there. Here's a picture of the opening, which is smaller than what Comer found 20 years ago. At the time, he said it was 3 by 3, but it's been sealed by the Forest Service within the last 10 years. They put some plastic in and then sprayed foam in to discourage people from going back in. Not a very safe spot, probably. So, last dead body. In 1905, Bees Cove shot and killed a neighbor. He had a long history of disputes with the neighbors, and there were property line disputes and disputes about the road and all kinds of stuff. William Berg was near the property line and moving some logs that he cut, and Bill thought he was on his side of the line, so he was out there with his gun, and he told him to get lost, and Berg told him to go to hell. And so, according to the story, Coyote Bill said, "I'll defend my property," and he shot him twice. Once in the leg, and apparently hit the femoral artery. And rather than go and try to help him, Coyote Bill went into town and gave himself up. But he was ultimately tried for murder in Missoula, and he was convicted and sentenced to be hanged. But his lawyers appealed, and apparently there were several bases for appeal. The one that was mentioned most prominently was that the charging document had failed to specify that the murder had taken place in Missoula County. And the Supreme Court of Montana awarded him a new trial, and he got the venue changed because he was pretty well known, and not in a good way probably in Missoula. And so the trial, the appeals trial took place in Helena, and he was sentenced to 10 years. he served about 6 years in Deer Lodge, and he'd already been in jail for about a year by the time he got there. And when he got out, he moved back over into this area, but more up into the Arley and Dixon area. And according to the Harmon book, he was found dead. He had found some more mining claims because he was definitely interested in mining. He was found dead on Magpie Creek, which is a few miles west of Dixon. There's even a street sign along Highway 200 that says Magpie something. And his throat and wrists were cut, according to the Harmon account. So I'm guessing it was murder. Maybe somebody got back at him, I'm not sure. But anyway, that was the end of Coyote Bill. Okay, phew. I apologize. I've gone over for sure here. And now I'm waiting for the slide. There we go. But I think this is a really unique spot that we've got here in Missoula. Because it's been essentially uninhabited for almost a century now, and there was quite a bit of settler activity up there in the early 1900s. It really is an outdoor museum, and it's something that I think is a great resource for the area. I hope people will visit with respect. These are archaeological sites, so federal law prohibits digging or removing things or anything else. These tin cans are more than 50 years old, so they count as artifacts. And it seems like a place that's great as a museum where, if it's left alone, people can go up and look around and learn some of the stories, and it's a great resource, I think. I've also been asked to mention that metal detecting, although it's often allowed on the National Forest, is also prohibited on archaeological sites, and so that shouldn't be going on here either. But in the very end of the Comer thesis, there's a reference to an earlier article that suggests that this area might be a good candidate for a National Historic District, or to be put on the Register of National Historic Places. And I'm thinking that's something that maybe your group, as having an interest in the watershed and the creek, might be interested in following up on. I'm not sure if anything's ever come of it, and I suspect there'd be a lot of paperwork involved, but to me at least it seems like the kind of resource that would be great to recognize in that way. So, thanks.
Okay, does anyone have any questions? Here's a question. Wait, is this supposed to be on?
Does the Missoula Public Library have the actual Poe book from 1992?
Not that I'm aware of. But the Mansfield Library does. You have to go to the archives to request it. I haven't checked this library, so it's possible, but I think unlikely. There weren't many copies made.
They do have a.
They do?
They have that
Okay.
here.
Yeah, great.
Any more questions?
Are you writing like an article or anything about this when you're doing all the research?
No, I have no intention to, although I think it would be neat to find a way to let people know some of the stories while they're out at the sites. I suspect that cell phone coverage out there is not very good, so I'm not sure that there's a way to do that, but
Eagle Scout project.
something like that perhaps, yeah. Mary.
Are you going to lead some more hikes to the area?
Well, I'd be happy to do that sometime, and actually, I didn't mention it, but Forrest and Flossie Poe apparently organized, they were instrumental in forming the Friends of the Rattlesnake group back sometime that lobbied for the creation of the recreation area in the wilderness. And I guess in the 1980s, they did bus tours. Occasionally, they got permission to take a vehicle up, and they would go out and show people some of the sites, and of course, they knew much more about it than I do, but I'm sorry I missed those. But yeah, I'm interested in doing that sometime if people are interested. Yes.
Quick one, I always walk by those apple trees. What homestead was that part of?
Which ones? Because there are multiple.
Spring Gulch.
Up Spring Gulch.
Yes.
They were on that last slide.
There's like 4 apple trees.
There's also a lilac tree.
Oh, there we
So-
go. That's it.
So, yeah, I underestimated how long it was going to take, but I did take a couple other slides and stick them at the end just in case I was short. Need to be worried about that. But Yeah, those four along the Spring Gulch Trail are the Vassar homestead, which is one of the sites in the Comer thesis. Vassar was French-Canadian. Life in the Rattlesnake was pretty difficult, I think. I didn't mention, but Emma Poe, according to the 1910 census, had had 8 children during her roughly 10 years of marriage, but only 3 were still living in 1910. So a lot of kids died pretty early, and that was the case for the Vassars too. But yeah, that's a Vassar homestead.
They were planted maybe in the early
Somebody must have planted them sometime early on, because one of the things that I guess many of the farms had some fruit trees, and they would have had a cow and a horse. Later on, there were several dairies up there. The Swansons from that very first site in the 1920 census are shown as dairy farming, which was not typical earlier on.
That attic that the 3 Swedes dug,
Yeah.
what was that dug into belt rocks, and what were they chasing back there?
Well, I think they were after gold, and you know, most of the rocks up there are the belt rocks, but if you look at the tailings from the mine, there's stuff that's definitely granitic in character there. So there must have been some small intrusion or something that they found, and that's what they were looking for. I think they were trying to follow that back in. Yeah.
You talked with Homer regarding your research, and you guys could combine efforts.
I certainly have some questions for him. I tried looking up at one point back in the summer, and I'm not sure. I think he's still in the area. I found something that suggested he was a consulting archaeologist up in Lincoln, but what I found didn't have any email address or phone number or anything like that. I haven't pursued it very much, but I may be able to make contact, because I have now talked to the Lolo Forest archaeologist that kind of supervises the site, and it sounded like she knew him and maybe could be in touch. So.
Was his master's from UM?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, well, thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you very much.